My name's Jackie Mulville. And can I welcome you all to our penultimate or last? I don't know. I think there's one next week or not. Anyway, to our seminar. And this week's, so I've got to click my continue button. This week, Alan Lane is going to be talking to us. I did have the title of his talk and I've now lost it. I know he's talking to us about Llangors, and I'm sure Alan is familiar to a number of you, having worked at the university for quite some time, but not for much longer, I think we can say. Alan has announced his intention to retire. And so unfortunately, he will not be hanging out down the corridor that much anymore. So Alan's worked on a range of kind of themes through his archaeological career. And I guess I met him hanging out in the Hebrides years ago, looking at Hebridean ceramics. And then the other part of, so works in Scotland in ceramics, and quite often has been working quite a lot of early medieval settlements in Wales. So Llangors Crannog was, I guess as Callum's going to tell you, is a project that was a joint project between the university and the museum, and I personally was involved, obviously, because I did some of the faunal analysis. But anyway, Alan, tell us, are there any other Crannogs anywhere else other than Scotland? Can you do the sherbet?
Okay.
Yeah, we can see that. Cool.
Okay. I think I'm losing a bit of the title off the top of the screen, possibly, but so
I think it's okay on ours, Alan. I think.
Is it? Ah, okay,
yeah.
Right.
It's probably because you're sharing the screen. The band will go over it. Yeah.
Okay, right. Okay, so are there any Crannogs south of Hadrian's Wall and east of the Irish Sea? And is Llangors a dramatic historical anomaly? So before I kind of launch into that, then I can draw your attention to this volume because Mark Redknapp, the National Museum, and I managed to bring Llangors to publication at Christmas 2019. We were intending to have a book launch and try and get publicity and, you know, try and get some press coverage. Unfortunately, I think we dragged our feet slightly, or that possibly the museum did, and we then had the COVID lockdown. So we haven't managed to get as much publicity about the publication as we might have hoped, although it has been reviewed in a few places. For those of you who want to check some of the things I'm going to say, the volume is available from Oxbow. It's cheaper with Amazon, undercutting Oxbow, and apparently there are Kindle editions if you want a spoken version. Although I don't quite know. No, I suppose you get the illustrations. The key thing, of course, with a project like this, any big excavation project, is that it involves a lot of teamwork. So the publication is particularly with Mark Redknapp of the National Museum. The original excavation involved Ewan Campbell, who's now Glasgow University, and we have, I think, about 30 contributors to the volume, specialists of various kinds. So what I'm going to say to you today, to some extent, reflects my view. On some things it might be slightly different from Mark's, but by and large, it's as in the volume. And I want to just say it's involved. The work has involved lots of the staff of the National Museum, staff and students of Cardiff University, and we've had numerous specialists offering advice and opinions. But I'd particularly like to thank Tony Daly, who was lead draftsman for the National Museum and did a fantastic job in bringing it to publication and hopefully making the form of the illustrations as intelligible as possible. So what I want to do today is just address some questions, which are things that arose either before we began the work or now. So first of all, is Llangors a Crannog? Which might seem a funny question to some of you, but there have been doubts expressed in the past. So I'm going to talk about what date it is. Is it an Irish Crannog? Is it a royal site? And in many ways, is it unique? And then finally, and very briefly, a question of its future. So Llangors, for those of you who are not local, is in mid Wales, in Breconshire. So it's just to the east of Brecon. And it lies in a kind of basin of quite good land between the catchments of the rivers Wye and Usk, with the really quite big hills and relatively barren areas, the Brecon Beacons to the south, the Black Mountains to the east, and then the main massif of central Wales, Mynyddypont, rising up to the north. The Usk Valley runs through east-west, just south of Llangors, and the current line of the A40, but one of the main Roman roads running through into West Wales. And this is an area that was central to the small Welsh kingdom of Brycheiniog. And as you'll see, that this is relevant to our interpretation of the site. Llangors Lake, and we have a Welsh name, Llyn Syfadden, but which I don't believe is in any current use, but existed as historically. And one thing you'll see in a few places, you'll see slightly different spellings of Llangors. So we follow a Welsh spelling, Llan-Gors, for the village and monastery, which is just to the north of the lake. The settlement just visible up to the right. But we've using the English name for the lake, Llangors, one word. And some of the museum publications at previous will have used variants on the form. As far as I know, Llyn Syfadden has not been in current use within the area, which is why we adopted the English usage. This is a view. Sorry, if I can go back. Oops. Sorry, the Crannog is a little wooded island just off the north shore, so you can perhaps see at the top of the picture, and viewed rather more closely. Some of you who are familiar with this area will know that this was an adventure camp built just on the shore, which unfortunately I think damaged some of the deposits and some material that you'll see. There is a picture from by G.K. St. Joseph, so in the Cambridge aerial photography records, which shows the vegetation and reed swamp spreading almost continuously through to the shore. The site was found in the middle of the 19th century, possibly because the water level was dropped, and it's found by two antiquarian brothers, apparently rowing on the lake, and they noticed timbers sticking from the water. The middle of the 19th century is the kind of heroic age of Crannog discovery. People were aware of the Swiss lake villages, very well preserved timber structures, houses, and full of material. And at the same time, artificial island sites or crannogs were being dug and explored in Ireland and in Scotland in large numbers. So the top illustration is a kind of, I think, a 19th century indication of what they thought a crannog might have looked like. As I say, it was discovered by two antiquarian brothers, and they knew that they were looking at a crannog. They made that identification. As you can see from the illustrations, which they published very quickly, we have lines of oak planks, and in fact you can see there's two lines there, which then continues round. There's also roundwood posts in some numbers, and then in among here there's some stonework as well, and you'll see some horizontal timbers lying on the surface. The second illustration gives you again some indication of what it might have looked like with the lower water level, although we think that the artist has probably stripped some of the vegetation off. And then you can see oak slab piles, as they describe them, and roundwood posts, which they excavated. And you have then a kind of profile here showing, and then a section. It was recognized as, or claimed as a crannog at the time. And the Woolhope Naturalist Field Club, who were based in Hereford, arranged an outing to investigate both the crannog and look at aspects of the flora and fauna of the area, you know, sort of classic 19th century broad set of interests. And they kind of clearly had a discussion about whether the site was genuinely a crannog or not. But J.E. Lee, who was the translator of the Swiss Lake Villages volume and was a local antiquarian, made a very positive identification. The problem was that there were no diagnostic artifacts, but there was a large animal bone assemblage, and so the early reports have some discussion about whether the animal species might represent a sort of archaic period, you know, possibly as early as the Neolithic or Bronze Age. But after some discussion, the idea that the cattle were of a sort of a particularly early type was dropped. So there was some uncertainty about the date of the site. It was accepted as a crannog, as I say, both by J.E. Lee and by Robert Munro, who was again the sort of 19th century doyen of crannog studies. Published Ancient Scottish Lake Villages, and he actually published a section about Llangorse at the time. He was, however, rather critical of the excavation and suggested that they would have found artifacts if they had kind of looked harder, which is, I think, possibly a little harsh. The next sort of step in interest and identification of the site was in the 1920s, when this logboat was found a few hundred yards to the east of the site. And Cyril Fox of the National Museum in Cardiff studied the boat and came up with a classification and suggested it was likely to be late Iron Age or Romano-British period. And that date was then applied to the crannog, or it was thought that it was likely, although in fact the canoe wasn't, the logboat wasn't actually from the site itself. Following that, I think Llangorse kind of dropped out of archaeological view, although Hubert Savary included it in a paper in about 1970. Nobody found any other Crannogs in Wales. The Crannogs sites of this type were not known in England, and because it was, seemed to be a peculiarity, I think skepticism set in. Royal Commission surveyors who visited the site in 1973 expressed the view that the timbers might not be ancient. And indeed, as late as 1997, when the Brecknock inventory was published by the Royal Commission, they accepted that it was a Crannog, but then stated that it differed fundamentally from the Irish and Scottish examples, which I think seemed to me to be actually questioning the reality of the site. I was actually first introduced to this site by Leslie Alcock, who some of you will know had been one of the key academics in Cardiff, and then went to Glasgow as the first professor of archaeology there. And I studied with him, in the course of which he got me to read about the Llangorse Crannog. And I must confess, I was skeptical. When I looked at it, the illustrations were bound in a separate part of the volume. And so it seemed to me a bit unlikely. The idea of a sort of, single example in Wales, it kind of offends archaeological, principles. We like to work with sets and with things that we can make comparisons of. But having been appointed to the job in Cardiff in 1979, I visited Llangorse in the early 80s, rode out to the site, and I was absolutely flabbergasted to see oak timbers sticking out of the water. And it seemed to me it was quite clear this was what they'd claimed. It was a Crannog site. Ewan Campbell and I did some initial work on the site. We managed to plan the site and sample some of the timbers, which gave us dendro dates of the 8th century at earliest. We didn't have sapwood, so we didn't have the final date of cutting of the trees, but it showed that the site was likely to belong to the 8th or 9th century. We also recognized the historical information that could be applied to the site that might put it firmly into the late 9th century. About the same time, Mark Redknapp was appointed to the National Museum, and Mark was an experienced underwater archaeologist and medievalist. And so we launched a joint project with the National Museum, with Mark managing a diving team, and myself and Ewan Campbell with the student team working on the dry land. Not many Crannogs are fully excavated or are explored unless they're already dried out. And in some cases, where if they're in small lochs and small lakes, they can be excavated because they're no longer wet. But so to excavate where the site is actually still partly in water, the site was a scheduled ancient monument, so obviously permission would be restricted, but the site was quite clearly being eroded. We could see it had been eroded in the 19th century and was continuing to be eroded in the 1980s. And therefore, as I say, a joint project involving limited land excavation, but a kind of detailed scrutiny of the shoreline was launched. And as you can see, there were some difficulties. This is very murky water, quite difficult to see, particularly once anybody sort of walks in it. And so it involved the divers in full outfits, but in some cases in quite shallow water. We were able to clean the shorelines, remove surface stone, and then record in detail the timbers. And so you see in this picture the condition of the oak planks, and obviously where they penetrate, they rise out of the underlying shell marl, they tend to suffer from degradation and insect attack, and also erosion. So in this picture you can see planks and then the vertical posts which occur in other areas. So what we were recording are these lines of vertical oak planks, and where they go into the shell marl, they're perfectly preserved. In some cases with the outer bark and with all the facets from the woodworking visible on them. Mark undertook a detailed survey of the shorelines, and you can see on the left-hand side of the picture search corridors. So the divers were working, as I say, in very poor visibility, excavating principally by hand and sieving material. So a large amount of the finds from the site were recovered from eroded deposits. Down in the bottom, you see again some search corridors and a small excavation that was principally within the eroded water area, but just going onto the edge of the site. Then the main university trench here, this L-shaped element on running from the southern shore out towards the eastern shore, and then a number of other small areas of exploration, and then including this one up on the north shore, which subsequently you will see is really quite important. So what we produced is detailed plans with the timbers being numbered, and this shows you the edge of one of the plank palisades, and then where it turns sharply to the west. And then the dry land excavation, in some cases with preserved timbers. So you see here the vertical planks, and then areas of interwoven wood fence lines just inside. In some areas, the timber is in very good preservation, and you can perhaps just make out in this top right hand where a post has driven into the ground. From mapping that material, we constructed what seems to be a fairly convincing plan. So this is using timbers that were visible or in some cases projected. So we have a plank palisade running across the site here, so present within the university trench, Trench A, and then coming out into the eroded area over on the right hand side. And then that line continues round. We then have a second plank palisade in this area here, and then a further one taking in this area. So these colours represent what we think is the construction phasing of the site. There's then vertical roundwood piles further out, which are less clearly part of a constructed main site, but I'll show you a reconstruction in a moment. And then the other thing I want to draw your attention to is this line running out here, which is evidence of a timber bridge. So rather than describing it as a causeway, this is posts supporting some kind of walkway running out to the northern shore. So the construction evidence, at the bottom we have what seems to be a natural peat core. This is undisturbed peat, and you can see that in this right-hand slide. Then laid on top of it, we have brushwood, carefully laid, and you see running in two different directions. And then pinning the brushwood down, we have thicker oak beams, which have notches within them, where they've been kind of pinned to the ground. Now, one important thing to just point out on this right-hand slide is that in this area, the brushwood has dried out. So I think there's no doubt that the fluctuating lake levels and the variation in the degree of waterlogging affects the survival of the timbers. This shows you one of these oak beams, and then with a stake driven through a notch within the beam. Laid on top of that is this then rubble, and this would involve transportation, tons of rubble that wouldn't have been available in the immediate vicinity of the shoreline, and would have to be transported in. And then on top of that, then we think there may have been some soil and deposits, but unfortunately, the fluctuating lake levels had resulted in these surface areas being washed off. So at least within the area that we were able to excavate, we didn't have preserved floor levels on that top. This shows you part of that university trench with the oak planks still preserved and standing up, and then lines of roundwood posts outside of that. The eastern shore is to the right of this picture. So this shows you again our interpretation of how the site is constructed. It starts off with this initial kind of D-shaped enclosure. It then has an addition to the south, and then one to the west, and then finally some a slightly less clear construction added on the south side. The blue line represents the eroded shoreline, so you can see there's been a large amount of erosion all around these areas. As a result of the prevailing wind, silts and soils were being deposited to the north. So this side of the site was being protected by deposition of soil. And we find a whole series of pile lines. So these are sort of roundwood posts running across the trench, which we interpret as an indication that during the really quite short lifetime of the site, sediments were building up and they were constructing kind of shorelines, presumably in order to make it possible either to land or to utilize part of the site. This is a National Museum reconstruction of what the Crannog might have looked like, with the bridge running to the north. So this is turned round a different direction from the plan that you've just seen. The buildings in it are obviously hypothetical, but these oak plank lines are as we could excavate and record. So I think there is no doubt that the site is a crannog. It's an artificial island, and it's very similar to those that are recognised in Scotland and in Ireland. And this is what was recognized in the 19th century, and it was understood that Llangors was very like those sites, and people were already aware of the kind of absence of sites within England. So what date is the Crannog? Well, there is a significant flint assemblage from the site, both Mesolithic, a small number of Mesolithic diagnostic features, and then Neolithic and possible Neolithic early Bronze Age material. However, none of this material is stratified in a way to indicate the age of the site, and nor is it in the peat underneath. It appears to be eroding out from the occupation deposits on the top of the site. So this is a distribution of different dates of material, and it's identical to the material of later date that you'll see in a moment. The date of the site, however, is given by dendrochronology. We took a significant number of samples. This confirmed the initial dates we had that showed that at the earliest it was 8th century. But what we have are sapwood dates. So this is the outer bark preserved on quite a number of the timbers. And these are identified by the specialists as showing that the trees had spring and summer growth on them. So they're cut down sometime in either the late spring or summer of particular years. And these run 889, 890, 892, 893. And there's nothing that need be any later than that. The other dates where they appear to be longer. This is when we don't have the outer wood, and so this is the adding of possible dates onto things. And we can see how these then tie in with the Palisades. So this first phase Palisade, possibly as early as 889. It's kind of 889, or it could be 890. We've then got 890 dates from the same Palisade round here, and numbers of the same trees are recognizable within the tree rings. We've then got a couple of dates, 892 and 893, but nothing any later than that. Now, obviously, the date the tree was cut down doesn't necessarily date the point at which the site was constructed, but given the quality of the bark and the preservation, it seems unlikely that more than a year, perhaps at most, could have gone by. So we're confident that the site then was constructed about 889, 890, those early centuries. Now, what's more remarkable about the site is that we actually have what seems fairly clearly a historical reference to its destruction. So this is part of what's usually known as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, and in particular, there's a section known as the Mercian Registry, where there are a number of references that particularly apply to Mercia. And this tells us that an Anglo-Saxon cleric, who we're told was guiltless, was killed with his companions, and that this was on the 16th of June. And then apparently linked, we're told that Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, King Alfred's daughter, effectively Queen of the Mercians, sent an army into Wales, broke down Brecnanmere, and took the wife of the king as one of 34. This statement appears to link the killing of the cleric with the action of the Mercian queen. Brecon Mere is the English name for the lake. I mean, this is the earliest name reference we have for the lake, which is interesting in itself. And it seems highly likely, if not certain, that we're talking about an attack on the Crannog. This Mercian raid takes place in the middle of the Viking wars of the late 9th and early 10th century. The construction of the Crannog round about 890 is a point where various Viking armies were storming through the Welsh border, and the Wessex kings, and sometimes in alliance with Welsh kings, were trying to stop them and defeat them. And then the destruction of the site again in the early 10th century, it is in the point where Ethelfled, as Queen of the Mercians, was constructing burhs and retaking areas from the Viking lords of who'd seized large parts of Mercia in the earlier part of the 9th century. So we have what appears to be a kind of convincing combination of archaeological and historical dates, and affecting this small kingdom, Welsh kingdom of Brycheiniog, and our interpretation based on both earlier historical sources, when the Brecon kings were actually subject to King Alfred and had kind of sought the protection of Alfred against the kings of North Wales, is that at this point, this later point in the 10th century, they've jumped the wrong way and possibly sided themselves with a Viking army, which has led to this Mercian punishment raid. So the suggestion that the Brecon queen was captured with her companions on the Crannog obviously suggests that this is a royal site. We also have evidence from the Llandaff charters that there were royal estates. So this is a study of there's a group of Llandaff charters that refer to Brycheiniog, and one of them is identifiable with this immediate area around Llangors Monastery. This is work by Andy Seaman, who has managed to plot the boundaries with really great confidence and allow us to identify the location. So we believe we have a royal Crannog, which is destroyed then in 916, and royal properties which are donated to the church a bit later in the locality. So the identification of the site as royal seems pretty convincing. If one looks at the finds, some of it will seem quite mundane. I mean, particularly those who are used to kind of rich English sites. But there's dress fasteners, there are beads, there's evidence of metalworking, there's evidence of drinking vessels. They're objects of some status. But there's then a few objects which really argue for, again, the higher status, and I would argue back the identification of the site as royal. In among this is the animal bone assemblage, which this is one of the best early medieval assemblages from Wales, as I'm sure many of you know, because of acidity. Animal and human bone doesn't survive very well within Wales, but from the areas of collection offshore, so obviously redeposited material, but also from the excavations of Trench A and Trench C, we have something like 40,000 fragments of bone. And you can see from the illustration, the bone is in really good quality. Something like 10% of that assemblage is identifiable to species. And those species in themselves are interesting. There's really very high percentages of pig, which would support the idea that we're looking at kind of high status food and feasting, and also unusually high percentage of wild mammals, including deer. And so it looks as if deer hunting and feasting on venison was a significant part of the process. So these animal bone assemblages, as I say, this is one of the best. The publication of it, I think I can say without embarrassing Jackie, that this is the first major modern bone assemblage to be published in for early medieval Wales. The quantities and the quality of it are extremely interesting. And what they show, along with the cereal remains, that this is a consumer site. This is not a farm. You know, we don't find, you know, the kind of evidence that would suggest that people are farming from the site, but they are consuming. And again, this kind of backs up our claim that this is royal. There are then a number of objects that both support the idea of high status and also the idea that that there's an Irish connection. So the object top left is fragment of an Irish pseudo-penannular brooch, probably of 8th or 9th, early 10th century date, but an Irish type. We then have fragment of a house shrine. So this is the carrying hinge from the side of a house shrine with elaborate enameled decoration, and you can see little crosses and an elaborate glass decorative element. You see a comparison with the Bologna shrine. And the reconstruction which the National Museum have in the new museum displays at St. Fagans, which some of you may have seen. Now, obviously, we don't quite know. This is a religious shrine. These objects would have held either perhaps fragments of saints' bones or perhaps cloth associated with the saint. Now, we don't know whether a complete shrine was present on the island at the time the site was sacked. All we have is the fragment that we recover. But again, the best parallels are from Ireland. And so this is another object that would support the idea that we're looking at a place with strong Irish origins. The other object, which is one of the most remarkable finds, is fragments of a tunic. You can see as it was initially discovered, fabric crushed up on top of a piece of wood. This took it took an extremely long time to study it, pull it up, separate the fragments, because although you can see the preservation of the weaving and the quality of the textile, it's extremely fragile. This is the kind of thing that if you touch with it at all, or if you touch it at all, you're liable to break it. Possibly carbonized, although it's not absolutely clear, but certainly denatured from its original condition. And as unfolded, a whole series of quite detailed aspects of a cloth material, which we think most likely represents a tunic. There is some debate about how it was produced and whether it could have been actually woven, and it combines silk and linen materials. So it's silk embroidery, little animals and beasts related to the linen background. And these can be compared with preserved textiles from church collections on the continent, and of course the St. Cuthbert fabrics from the north of England are the other major comparison for roughly the same period. This took I mean, several of the National Museum specialists, I would say, years of work to both disentangle what was there, to identify the shapes on it, and to then provide the illustrations and the evidence. We can find parallels for it. These kinds of little lines along the top, confronted birds, and some slight which may be juxtaposed images of hares associated with other decorative elements. And you see a comparison here with a Frankish woven braid. So this is as a unique object. To find something on a secular site is virtually unheard of, to find decorative fabric of this quality. The comparisons, as I say, these things are sometimes preserved in church locations, but to find this on an excavated settlement is really quite remarkable. So we have then this picture of a Crannog, which we think is a royal site, and with strong Irish connections. Following the destruction of the site, we believe it's abandoned. There is no sign of rebuilding. However, we then get references to the site in subsequent medieval documentation. Gerald of Wales, writing in the late 12th century, tells us that the local people say that there are buildings and pasture sometimes visible. There's also miraculous happenings. The birds sing when a true Prince of Wales rides by. A slightly later source, Walter Map, tells us that there's a palace or a town drowned through the wickedness of the prince and his subjects. And it seems likely that the structures of the Crannog were visible in the 12th century. We have a later phase of activity in the 16th century, where there's actually a kind of lawsuit and apparently some evidence of fighting between landowners, possibly on the Crannog. John Dee, the Queen Elizabeth the first necromancer, apparently was trying to conjure gold at a lake in Breconshire. And these continue into the 19th century. There's folk tales of a destroyed palace. And in 1990, Raymond Williams, in his book, The People of the Black Mountains, sets a Viking rape and pillage story in 896. I must confess I was staggered when the 896 came so close to the dendro dates that we subsequently got. But I then realized it's based on the radiocarbon date for the canoe that came out as being 8th or 9th century. So it's the site. How unusual is the site? In the 19th century, Monroe and others were clear that there were not many identifiable Crannog sites visible in England. Llangors was the first one to be recognised in Wales, and nobody has managed to find another. Rick Peterson, who was then a student here, went diving in Bala, Lake Bala in North Wales, where there's a similar story of a sunken town, but we couldn't find any evidence to back up that identification. But what we have are hundreds of sites, both in Scotland and in Ireland, and some quite close parallels to the structure of the Llangors Crannog. So this combination of timber and stone with plank lines and palisades can be matched quite precisely in Ireland at the right kind of period. The majority of the Irish sites, and there are hundreds of them, appear to be early medieval, although running into the medieval period. Within Scotland, there are late Bronze Age sites. There's now sites identified to the Neolithic that seem similar. So are there any, as I say, south of Hadrian's Wall and east of the Irish Sea? Well, the Glastonbury Lake village is in some sense similar, although it's not, it doesn't appear to be the constructed island that the bulk of the Scottish and Irish sites are. There's dumped material, possibly dumped on top of a fen car. Some of the earlier descriptions of the site include information about woodland underneath the material. Sorry, if I can just go back. Must Farm, some of you will be familiar with the really very spectacular discovery of what seems to be houses on stilts above a river or on the edge of a river, which when they were burnt down and collapsed. But again, this is rather different from the Crannog sites recognised within Ireland. The parallels are very much with the Llangors and the Irish sites. Within Scotland, there's clearly a range of dates and different construction methods, and there is some debate in Scotland whether any of the Crannogs were actually raised platforms on posts, which is one of the suggestions in Perthshire. So the questions I set about, so yes, it's a Crannog. We're confident that it's constructed late 9th century, destroyed early 10th century. The parallels, both for objects and for the techniques, it seems to me, point very firmly to Ireland. And this fits in with the origin legend of the kings of Crannog, where we're told that a royal daughter goes and marries an Irish king, and then Brychan is the son who returns to kind of claim the throne. And Crannog is named after this person, and it does appear to be an Irish name. Is it royal? Yes, it seems. I think that's the legitimate interpretation. The degree of workmanship, the amount of effort made into construction, the high status objects, the food debris. Is it unique? It's unique as a site that we can pin a name to and an actual historical event. There are no other early medieval sites with this kind of certainly not in Wales, and I don't think elsewhere in England or Scotland, where one can say with confidence that we have both the archaeological phase and the historical document for its destruction. What about its future? As I suggested at an earlier stage, the site is affected by fluctuating lake levels, by drying and wetting. Cadw have built a rock bund, a protective arc of stonework around the south side to stop erosion. So erosion of the site is now seems to be stopped. Obviously, sometimes when you protect a shoreline, you can cause erosion somewhere else. So clearly the site needs to be monitored. However, the deposits are affected by the plant growth, trees, reeds growing on them. The tunic had holes punctured in it by reeds. And there's no doubt that there are lots of fragments of textile still in the deposits that exist. The animal bone assemblage on the northern side of the site is the best preserved area, and the point where the bridge enters the Crannog is potentially an area where we could get preserved timber work and arguably the likelihood of other artifactual material. So I think it's worth thinking about whether the site needs further exploration. I hasten to add, not by me and not by Mark Redknapp. So as I say, this area where potentially we could have a constructed entrance just to the side of where the university trench was. So with that, I just want to thank the National Museum for their support of the project for the last 30 years. Because this was a research project and both Mark and I and other people had other jobs to do, we were not able to process this as quickly as we might have done. But I want to thank both the National Museum and both Cardiff University and my colleagues for support in carrying out the work and bringing it to publication. Thank you.